Good afternoon, everyone. Wanted to welcome you to the August edition of the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership webinar series that's being hosted by MCAP with support from the University of Minnesota Water Resources Center. I wanted to welcome for this afternoon's presentation Hilarie Sorensen, who is the climate specialist with the 1854 Treaty Authority, governed by the Bois Forte Band of Chippewa and the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. Her role there is to implement the 1854 Ceded Territory Climate Change Adaptation Plan, which was completed in 2016 through collaboration with Bois Forte, Grand Portage, and Fond du Lac. Prior to joining the 1854 Treaty Authority, Hilarie worked with Minnesota Sea Grant as the climate change extension educator. Her education background includes a BA in International Studies and Spanish from the University of Minnesota Duluth, a master's in environmental studies from Lakehead University in Ontario, and another master's in marine biology from the University of Oregon, Oregon Institute of Marine Biology. Hilarie grew up in Chicago and currently lives in Duluth, where she spends most of her time on, in, and around Lake Superior. So please join me in welcoming Hilarie, and Hilarie, you can take it over from here.
Thank you, Joel, and welcome everyone. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Okay, I hope that everyone is seeing my slide all right. So again, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being on this webinar today. I'm going to share a little bit about what is happening with climate change in Northeast Minnesota, introduce folks to the 1854 Treaty Authority, what our program does, and our Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment and Adaptation Plan. And then I'll highlight a few of our climate change projects that we've gotten off the ground in the last few years, as well as talk a little bit about what we have coming up next. So first, a little bit of an introduction for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the area. The 1854 Treaty Authority is an intertribal natural resource management organization that applies the off-reservation hunting, fishing, and gathering rights of the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, and Bois Forte Band of Chippewa in the ceded territory known as the Treaty of 1854. So you can see from the map on the left of the screen here, it covers most of what is today Northeast Minnesota. It consists of over 5.5 million acres. So again, our management is off reservation. So we work with a number of partners, including state, federal, county, and tribal partners on projects to preserve and protect the natural resources. So for example, we have a wildlife program that focuses a lot on moose and wolf surveys. We have a wild rice enhancement program, a fisheries program, invasive species habitat and environmental program. Climate change comes into this because it branches over all of these different natural resources and heavily impacts tribal communities, their access to these natural resources, the availability of resources, the health of the resources, and is particularly impactful due to the geographically defined boundaries of reservations and treaty areas. So as the climate continues to change and certain species shift their range out of these regions, band members may no longer have access to these culturally important resources. So about 5 years ago, in 2015, Fond du Lac, Grand Portage, Bois Forte, and 1854 Treaty Authority got together to start a project to investigate how climate change conditions already are and may continue to affect the landscape and species within this 1854 ceded territory and the respective reservations. So there was a needs assessment conducted, funding was obtained through the Bureau of Indian Affairs to begin to develop this vulnerability assessment and climate adaptation plan. Adaptation International and Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessments were the contractors on this project. One thing to note is that we didn't start this process from scratch. The Grand Portage Band was already in the process of developing their climate change plan. So we had a jumping off point of where to focus a lot of these, a lot of this project. And we will come back to the chart on the right. I just wanted to pop it up here. These are actually our vulnerability assessment results, but I'll come back to that in just a moment. So this project was a three-step process. First, it contained a rapid climate assessment, then a vulnerability assessment, and then particular adaptation strategies were developed for the natural resources in this area. So Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessments, or GLISA, and the University of Michigan led the project team's effort to compile and analyze detailed climate information, including both historic information and downscaled regional climate projections. So this was known as this rapid climate assessment. And just to note, the 1854 ceded territory covers portions of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Northeast Minnesota Climate Division and East Central Climate Division. And then this little check-marked box is where the 1854 ceded territory is. So once this rapid climate assessment was conducted, climate change impacts for Northeast Minnesota, as well as the Great Lakes region, were summarized. And so I'm sure most of you are familiar with these, but these are the big changes that we're seeing in Northeast Minnesota, as well as the larger Great Lakes region. This is looking at 1954 for 2017 and looking at temperature, frost reef preseason, total precipitation, and severe weather events. So since 1951, average air temperatures have increased by approximately 2.3 degrees Fahrenheit in the Great Lakes region. By mid-century or 2050, those average air temperatures are projected to increase by 3 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit. By the end of the century, are projected to increase by 6 to 11 degrees. So that's quite a bit. Since 1951, total annual precipitation has increased by 13.6% in the Great Lakes region. Future projections suggest that more precipitation on average will occur, but not necessarily during all seasons. Summer seasons may become drier, and this may not be for all locations depending on which downscaled climate model is being used. Reduced ice cover is something that I'll come back to throughout this presentation, but reduced ice cover and enhanced evaporation may lead to increased lake effect snowfall in the near term, but rising temperatures may also cause more winter precipitation to fall as rain as opposed to snow across the region by the late century. And then summer lake surface temperatures have been increasing faster than the surrounding air temperatures, with Lake Superior increasing by about 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit between 1979 and 2006. Annual average ice cover on the Great Lakes underwent a shift from actually higher amounts prior to the 1990s to lower amounts in recent decades. There still remains very strong year-to-year variability, and high ice years are still possible. And then just for northeastern Minnesota, but across the larger region as well, fall storms, particularly in October, have been really wreaking havoc on shoreline communities. So these shifts in temperature and precipitation have had impacts on the phenology, or timing of seasons upon which plants and animals depend for food, shelter, reproduction. And we're already beginning to witness some of these phenological mismatch in many regions, particularly in that winter season where most of these, the temperature is changing most drastically. So keeping these climate changes in mind, our vulnerability assessment homed in on several categories and species of particular interest to the project team based on their ecological and cultural importance to tribal communities. And an expert sub-team was identified for each of these categories listed on the slide, and a workshop was held in 2015 to follow-up calls to flesh out more of these particular vulnerabilities. So here's that chart again showing our vulnerability assessment results, where over 30 species, groups, and habitats were identified, and where 11 focus species were included in that workshop. I won't spend too much time on this, but just how to read it is across the top is showing the sensitivity of particular species. So ranked from being not very sensitive to climate changes, for example, white-tailed deer, all the way out to being extremely sensitive to climate changes, where you'll see species like moose, brook trout, paper birch, and boreal wetlands. And then across the other axis, you'll see adaptive capacity, and this is ranked from having species that have a high adaptive capacity or an ability to adapt more easily to changing conditions, down to a low adaptive capacity where species are really going to struggle with changes that are taking place. So you'll see these more of the greens and blues are species that may do a little bit better, will be better equipped to handle changes in climate. And then the reds and pinks are the species that are particularly vulnerable and also not able to adapt to changes that are happening. Now, there are 3 species in particular that are of cultural and economic and of great importance to tribal communities in Northeast Minnesota. I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about these. So moose is a very important species. It's important for subsistence and it's a cultural resource. It's central to the identity of the boreal forest. It also helps maintain healthy forests and wetlands by consuming shrubs and trees and serves as a food source for predators such as wolves. Moose have been in decline for years now in Minnesota due to a variety of different factors, including land use changes, habitat shifts, emergence of new disease vectors, pressure from predators, increasing number of parasites, and climate change exacerbates all of these other things that are going on. So moose, you'll see down in the pink area, are particularly sensitive to changes in climate and also have a low capacity to adapt to those changes. Monoman is the second species that we focus a lot of our climate adaptation efforts on. For thousands of years, wild rice or monoman has been harvested for food and has played a significant role in Ojibwe cultural practices. It's included in the migration story of Ojibwe people to this region and serves as an economic resource. It's also a source of food and shelter for a variety of fish and wildlife species. A monoman is an annual plant that grows from seed each year. It grows in lakes and streams after ice out in the spring in shallow water of about 1 to 3 feet, and it prefers soft organic sediments to grow in. The seeds ripen in the late summer or early fall, and the seed dormancy stage can last for years and requires cool temperatures below 35 degrees Fahrenheit during that dormancy stage. So monoman is quite sensitive to changes in temperature, water temperature, also in precipitation, particularly storms during the floating stage in the summer. It's sensitive to runoff from the land and water level fluctuations. And then finally, walleye are an important food source in the ceded territory and across the reservations. Walleye are a cool water species. They prefer cooler water, but some of the prey that they consume are cold water fish species. They spawn in rivers and lakes in shallow water in the spring, shortly after ice out generally. They need clean gravel area for their adhesive eggs to attach, and they hatch in the late spring. So some climate impacts to walleye could be from reduced ice cover or earlier ice out, providing less protection from wind and rain and sedimentation. Warmer waters could put stress on walleye themselves, but particularly prey species habitats, for example, cisco, as well as changes in seasons could affect the timing of spawning, hatching, and food. So from that vulnerability assessment, this climate change adaptation plan was developed and lists a lot of different, over 200 different adaptation strategies. So of course, that's a lot to focus on, and we couldn't implement every single strategy. So the development of the climate program over the last few years has really focused on 3 different areas. A monitoring program, and I'll highlight some of the projects that we have developed there. We focus a lot on phenology, or that change in seasons, and then an education outreach program as well. And the link at the bottom of the slide here takes you to our climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan for those who may be interested. So now I'm just going to highlight a few of our monitoring projects as examples of how we started to tackle this overall climate adaptation plan. The first one I'll talk about is monitoring water temperature throughout the ceded territory. So as I mentioned a moment ago with our vulnerability assessment results, cool and cold water fish, including walleye, are susceptible to a range of existing environmental conditions that could be further exacerbated by a changing climate. Water temperature in particular can influence walleye living space, prey fish, and timing of spawning and egg hatch. For over 20 years, the 1854 Treaty Authority, along with Fond du Lac Resource Management, have conducted spring and fall walleye surveys using electrofishing boats. And this is done to estimate adult populations, year class production, and monitor spawning and nursery habitat. So 5 years ago, in 2015, we began to build upon that program by choosing 20 walleye lakes from the electrofishing surveys to deploy continuous data temperature loggers during the open water season. And actually this past spring, we changed that so that the temperature loggers will be deployed year round. We did this to better understand how water temperature is changing in these lakes to help explain trends in these walleye assessments that have been going on. And those walleye assessments are used to inform management decisions such as setting length and harvest limits. So the map here is showing all of those targeted walleye lakes. And then the picture down here is what one of our temperature loggers looks like. So we typically try to deploy those in about 4 to 5 feet of water. And then this is an example of the past 5 years of data from those temperature loggers. This is 2015 through 2019. This is for one of the lakes that we monitor. And this is showing average temperature in degrees Fahrenheit, and then all of the years broken out by month. And that's the different colors. So for 2015, this lake didn't have June data, but for the rest of the years, you'll see June, July, August, and September. So 5 years isn't much to really start to see trends yet. So we are just starting to get to the point where patterns or trends are emerging. So hopefully in the next few years, this will be able to help inform some of those other walleye survey projects. Another seasonal shift that we're monitoring is the timing of spring lake turnover, the timing and duration of summer lake stratification, and then fall turnover, which again impacts fish habitat, spawning, and feeding cycles. 3 years ago, we chose a specific lake, a particular bay in this lake called Lake Vermilion, which is of great ecological and cultural importance, particularly to the Bois Forte Band. And we placed a temperature and dissolved oxygen logger chain, which is a 50-foot line pictured on the left of the slide here. And then it has 10 temperature loggers and 3 dissolved oxygen loggers spaced 1 meter apart on that line. Now this gives us a year-round depth profile of the bay to monitor temperature and dissolved oxygen changes through the seasons and how that might relate to habitat for cold water fish species such as cisco, which have a very narrow temperature and dissolved oxygen tolerance range where they're happy to hang out. And then on the right, this is just showing one season of data. So this is from 2018, and this is going from June 9th, 2018 until November 6th. And it's showing the water temperature and dissolved oxygen. The temperature is in the orange and the dissolved oxygen is in the blue. So you can see the kind of fluctuations that happen, and then in the fall, that rapid shift where temperature drops and dissolved oxygen rises. So a big part of this project is looking at the timing of when all of these cycles are happening and what that could mean for fish habitat. Then finally, for the monitoring that we do on lakes, we've seen a significant change in ice out dates throughout the state of Minnesota. But in Northeast Minnesota, an almost 2-week difference in how early ice is leaving some of these lakes. And this has been happening over the past 40 years, so this is definitely going to have cascading impacts on lake ecosystems. So as ice duration is shortened, it impacts the subsequent seasons, including that spring turnover that we were just talking about, as well as summer stratification, fall turnover, which is influencing light and dissolved oxygen, as well as productivity, temperature, evaporation, more exposure to wind and currents. So that's impacting fish habitat, spawning, feeding cycles. It can impact the life cycles of monomen and leaving a lot of areas particularly vulnerable to storms, sedimentation, and water level change. So from December through May, or through March or April of each year, depending on how much ice we have, we conduct monthly ice checks on 10 lakes throughout the ceded territory, and these lakes were chosen based on their ice records. So if there was some previous study taking place. And this is looking at ice cover, ice thickness, snow depth, and then the quality of ice. So not only are we looking at seasonal shifts as it relates to potential habitat change, but also safety for those folks that like to head out, particularly during that early winter or late winter time to ice fish. So those were a lot of our monitoring projects. Then we have a couple of studies that are particularly focused on phenology. So one of them is looking at a phenology of monomen or wild rice. So as part of this monomen monitoring program, we have 2 pheno cameras out at wild rice lakes to track the growth stages of wild rice, ice in and ice out dates, precipitation events, and waterfowl presence. So each year we compile time-lapse videos for the season to better understand change over time. And then in 2018, we started to place 2 acoustic recorders on those same wild rice water bodies to monitor frog and toad calls to better understand climate change impacts to wetland ecosystems and species diversity. And then as part of that, earlier, just this past spring, we started to participate in what will hopefully be a long-term project through Grand Portage to establish standardized waterfowl and herptile surveys in the 1854 ceded territory to assess spatial distribution and abundance of waterfowl and herptile species in various wetland habitats. And these habitats include deep marsh, open water, and vernal pools. So the survey includes doing a point count for waterfowl and basking species, and then a dip net and visual encounter surveys for amphibians. And we have, again, placed acoustic recorders at several of the survey locations. So that just started this year, and we don't have results yet, but hopefully that will start coming in soon. And then finally, some upcoming projects on the horizon that are either just getting going or planned for later this year. We are working with sugar maple harvesters to observe the timing of the sap run, the health of sugar maple stands, and the resilience potential of sugar maple to continued seasonal shifts. So harvesters for the past couple of seasons have been helping to collect environmental conditions data, including the timing of the sap run start, as well as what phenology signals folks are looking for to start those harvesting activities. And then also recording snow and weather conditions. And then upcoming this year, we're hoping to begin a snowpack monitoring project related to wildlife habitat with particular focus on areas where we have moose deer overlap, to look at how those winter seasonal changes with potentially more rain coming during those winter months impacting the quality of snow and the amount of snow that we have on the ground and how that relates to these different habitats. And then also possibly in recent years, we've seen some algae concentrations, particularly at boat landings on inland lakes in those September, October months. So it may start to work with partners on assessing what some of those algae blooms are, if they are harmful, or trying to address any questions that folks might have. So to wrap up quickly, we've gone over a few tools and examples of what we've been doing to start to address climate change and seasonal shifts and those impacts to natural resources and tribal communities. These tools can be used broadly for general adaptation planning or more targeted for specific areas and species, depending on the needs of a particular community. So at this time, I can take any questions, and my contact information is on the screen here, as well as a link to our website where you can find that more detailed climate adaptation plan. So thank you very much.
Great, Hilarie, thank you for that presentation and for joining us today. So as Hilarie mentioned, we have a little bit of time for Q&A. If you are in the audience, what we'd ask of you is to put your question in the Q&A panel, the button on the bottom, and then you can see what others might be asking. You can bring other things up to the top here. I'll share my screen so you can see what that looks like here. So Hilarie, as we're getting some questions in, I guess I have one, or I have a few that we can lead off with. So you shared several examples of monitoring and that kind of work that you're doing. Can you talk a little bit about how you all are thinking about using that data and information to help with adaptation actions into the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I mentioned, a lot of our monitoring projects are only a few years, have only been running for a few years at this point, but we're hoping that long term that those data will be able to supplement management decisions that are happening. So for setting certain harvest limits for fish and wildlife, for informing folks where good lakes are if you want to harvest monomen or sugar maple, or a lot of the different activities that a lot of those treaty rights that band members exercise. We're hoping to be able to share some information about not only what climate changes we're seeing up to this point, but where there might be areas for particular focus on protection or restoration.
Great, thank you. And another couple other questions that are coming in the chat. Just if folks could put those in the Q&A box, that helps, because it gives people a chance to rise some of those questions up to the top there and see what other people might be asking. So can you offer any thoughts about how your work and the work of the Treaty Authority intersects with the Minnesota travel industry and the Arrowhead?
Ooh, that's a great question. Thanks, John. Yeah, so I don't have a good answer to that. A lot of what we're doing is focusing on those band member needs, and so where they're going to harvest or hunt or fish. I don't quite know where that is in terms of intersecting with the travel industry up in this area, other than that we work with a lot of those state partners, including the Superior National Forest, the Department of Natural Resources, the Park Service, on, we share a lot of information back and forth on what we're seeing, any projects that we have going. And so I think that collaborative effort gets communicated out to the public. And so for folks traveling up to the area through all those different agencies and partners, there is additional information about just even conditions if they're looking at coming up to the area for a weekend. What's happening in different parks or public spaces.
Thank you. So another question about monitoring. So in your efforts, how do you all use the data you collect through the monitoring programs and incorporate traditional or indigenous ecological knowledge?
Yeah, so that's a huge part of anything that we do. So we have done a number of band member surveys just throughout our organization, and that helps to inform of where we should be focusing our efforts or what particular questions band members have. We also have a program that works more directly with cultural preservation, and so she helps to facilitate conversations with the tribes and helps to put on rice camps or sugar maple workshops or ice fishing with youth or hunting, youth camps, firearm safety to make sure that these practices are being passed down. One particular example that I have is for sugar maple of having band members come together and work with between elders and youth to share the different practices for the signals that are looked for when starting to go out and harvest sap, as well as how to maintain the health of a sugar maple tree and what these different seasonal changes might mean for continued harvest.
Great, thank you. I have a related question. So what's in the work that you all have been doing, what's the role of professionals versus citizens in monitoring or incorporating citizen science?
Mm-hmm. So that's another one that I can specifically talk about, the sugar maple, and having harvesters helping to collect data for us as they go out. So just real, what's the weather like on that day? What was the snowpack like? What signs did you look for? When did the sap runs start in your area? This is such a huge territory that we're super reliant on information from the folks that are out there. Invasive species is another area where we rely really heavily on citizen science, on folks helping to collect data about where they're observing invasive species, what the concerns are, so on and so forth. And then again, with the snowpack monitoring program that we're hoping to get up and running this year, that's another one where it'll be really important to have as many folks as possible helping to gather data about the snow conditions in their area.
Thank you. So one question it looks like a few people have is, how do you envision or hope your data will be incorporated in regional environmental planning efforts like the St. Louis River One Watershed, One Plan, or other regional activities?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, it comes through sort of a general answer to that question, but it comes through partnerships. So as much as possible, we work with all of these different planning organizations that are involved with climate adaptation planning or water quality planning. And we just try to share as much data and information and lessons learned back and forth. So as we continue to have more long-term monitoring in place, hopefully that does become useful on multiple levels of not only just how is temperature changing in this particular lake up by the boundary waters, but what does that mean for recreation, for management, for tribal communities, for all of the different uses and importance of those water bodies.
So a couple of, I think, or species or more specific questions. Can you discuss future loon population concerns?
Loon population?
Yep.
Ooh, that's a question for our wildlife biologist. We do participate with the Department of Natural Resources and conduct loon surveys each year to get an assessment of young loons. I don't know where things currently stand with loon populations, how they're doing or what is projected into the future, but you may have seen them on that vulnerability assessment chart that they are one of those species that are more vulnerable and have less capacity to adapt to climate change. So we're definitely involved in that, and that's actually another citizen science component of how having as many people as possible keeping an eye out and sending information about what they're seeing on their lakes.
So I mean, maybe I'll combine these into one, but have you identified specific tree species that are considered more resilient or adaptable or depending on how you want to answer, can you discuss any research related to paper birch?
Yeah, so paper birch, again, was maybe one of the most vulnerable and least able to adapt tree species from that vulnerability assessment. We don't have a particular research project focused on paper birch at this time, but I know that it has been a focus for a lot of the research institutions in this area, and I don't know where they've landed on that. As kind of going along with that, tree species that are expected to be a little bit more resilient, there are a number of projects, I believe, going on that we're working with folks in the Superior National Forest, with the universities, to look at different climate scenarios and which tree species may start to move into this area. The discussion of assisted migration has come up, and what different aspects of that, you know, there are ups and downs to all of these different strategies. But I think variety or diversity is really what has been a focus for those tree species. Is having a diversity is usually favorable. Actually, sugar maple, where we have a lot of focus, are sort of a medium vulnerability up in our area. I know in northern Wisconsin they're more vulnerable, but up here they're actually doing okay. And so that might be one of those species that we focus a lot of protection efforts on versus some of the more vulnerable species we may just start to see move out of this area. There's a lot of uncertainty there. Sorry, I'm not a forester. But there are a lot of current and upcoming projects that are focusing on just that question, and we're a part of those conversations.
So I might combine or add on to one question that's come up here. So the first part is, do you see implementing this model in other parts of the state with other tribal communities? And maybe more broadly than that, so what advice would you give to other organizations that are considering an adaptation plan and response like this one?
So for many of the tribal communities in Minnesota and Wisconsin do have climate adaptation plans. So those are definitely not the same. You know, there's so many different impacts and different resources that are, you know, everybody kind of needs their own in some way, shape, or form. But we definitely do collaborate on projects and share information back and forth. But I would say most of the tribal communities do have a climate adaptation plan or are doing similar monitoring of climate impacts in their areas. As far as advice, it's going to come back to this general question of partnerships. You know, it's really difficult to work in a silo when trying to develop something as big as an adaptation plan, and you know, the impacts are going to be so different for different communities, and the strategies are going to be different. So it's really getting as many people in the room as possible to really hone in on what are those particular issues, and as well as what are those strategies, and then learning from the different case studies that are going on. There's so much work that's being done. And so most of our things, these didn't start from scratch. These were projects that had been done elsewhere or on a smaller scale that we could learn from and adapt to our own particular needs. So that's what I would say, is just trying to share information as broadly as possible and working with as many folks as possible when starting to develop those plans.
So a specific partnership question looks like, do you have any interaction with Vermilion College through exchanging data, visiting speakers, things like that?
I have not. I'm also relatively new, so I'm not sure if we have in the past, but I would definitely be interested in learning more and working together.
So the next one, in terms of temperature and human comfort, climate change looks favorable in Northeast Minnesota. Have you considered what an increase in climate refugees to the area might mean for the region and tribal needs?
Yes, that was actually a big workshop that happened, I believe, last year, where that was talked about, people, additional population coming to northern Minnesota, particularly because of Lake Superior. And I think it's just really difficult to say what that would mean for tribal communities, but it is definitely a concern and something that we're thinking about. And yeah, I'm sorry, I don't really have an answer to that one. It is on people's minds, that I will say.
So we can see if anybody else asks a question right now, but in the meantime, I have one more that I was thinking about. So kind of given your experience and the experience of the treaty authority and the ceded territory, if you're talking with people that may not be as familiar with some of the unique aspects that you're working in and the history of those lands, what are some of the things that you would share with them about what makes climate change along with these jurisdictional and history issues so challenging?
Yeah, I mean, that's just it. It's a very rural area. There's a lot of land to cover, and they are fixed geographic boundaries. So I think one of the biggest, the biggest concerns, or the biggest concerns that we have is really access and availability of these resources to band members. And that is changing. It's quickly changing. And that's a challenge, but there also may be opportunities that we don't know what new species may start to move into the area and what that might mean for ecosystems. We focus a lot on invasive species, but there may be a number of different changes. Some of them may be beneficial. So I think it's just it's a unique area to be working in, particularly because Northeast Minnesota has such a unique environment with the different forest communities, where we have a lot of species that are at the very southern end of their range. Moose is an example of those, also some fur bearers like lynx. So, we may see drastic shifts in what species we see here very soon. And so I think the big challenge is that access and availability, but also just we're not looking very far out before we might start to see some of these changes. So I think it's a shorter timeline than what most people associate with climate change and thinking, oh, it's end of the century, many, many, many years ahead. Some of these changes really are happening now and in the next few years. So yeah, I guess that's, I don't really know if that answers your question, but those are a lot of what we're thinking about up here.
Yeah, that does. Thank you. Well, it looks like that has brought us to the end of our questions from the audience. Is there anything else that you wanted to to share?
I don't think so. Just to really appreciate folks being on today, and please do contact me if there are any follow-up questions or ideas. We're always looking for always looking for opportunities to work with folks. So thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Hilarie. Just to wrap up, so we'd really appreciate you taking some time to fill out a brief evaluation for this webinar, not only for our own uses, but it also has opportunities to share other ideas or topics to talk about. So when you close out of this, if things work, hopefully you'll be taken to that, and otherwise I'll post the link in the chat. Speaking of other topics, the next webinar will be on September 23rd from 12 to 1 p.m. and we'll be talking there with a couple of people on examples of climate adaptation in Minnesota agriculture. And if you are not yet subscribed to our NCAP email list, you can do so by visiting this link that I just posted in the chat. And again, I put in a plug for visiting our evaluation at the end of the seminar or the webinar. So thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we will see you next month. Thank you again, Hilarie.